I told myself it was just a role. I repeated that sentence in my head like a prayer I didn't believe in, but was too afraid to abandon. Just a role. Just a few hours. Just something to survive. I stood there wrapped in fabric that cost more than every year of my life put together, fabric that didn't belong to me, touching skin that felt like a stranger's life pressed against my own. People were smiling. Cameras were flashing. Everything around me screamed celebration. But inside me, something was screaming back, louder, sharper, angrier. I wasn't supposed to feel anything. That was the rule. That was the deal. I had walked into this knowing exactly who I was and who I wasn't. I was the woman who counted coins before buying bread. The woman who learned early that hope was dangerous because it made disappointment hurt worse. I was the woman who swallowed pride daily and called it strength because survival demanded it. This was never meant to be real. Not the dress, not the vows, not the man standing beside me. I told myself that if I kept my face calm and my thoughts locked away, I would walk out of this untouched, that I would collect what I was owed and return to my real life, the one where pain was familiar and therefore manageable. But standing there, surrounded by luxury I had never asked for, something inside me burned with humiliation. Not because I wanted any of it, but because it existed so effortlessly for people who never had to bargain their dignity to keep breathing. I felt like a lie wearing a crown. I remembered the night I said yes. I didn't say it because I trusted anyone. I said it because desperation has a way of dressing itself up as opportunity. Because when the world corners you long enough, you stop asking if something is right and start asking if it will keep you alive. I remember thinking, at least this way, I'm choosing the damage. That's what no one tells you about poverty. It doesn't just empty your pockets. It rewires your thinking. It teaches you to negotiate with pain, to rank suffering, to accept humiliation if it comes with relief. So, yes, I agreed. One day, one performance, no emotions. He barely looked at me when we first met. That should have comforted me. Distance felt safe. Coldness felt predictable. I mistook his indifference for professionalism and thanked whatever God was still listening that he wasn't pretending either. We were two people using each other for different reasons, and I told myself that was honest. But honesty has layers, and I didn't realize how deep this one would cut. Standing there, listening to words that meant nothing, I felt rage coil under my ribs. Rage at the irony, rage at the audience, rage at myself for standing still while my life was being dressed up into something it wasn't. I hated how easy it all looked. I hated how natural it seemed to everyone watching. I hated how alone I felt in a room full of witnesses. My anger wasn't loud. It was sharp and quiet, the kind that sinks into your bones and waits, the kind born from years of swallowing words, of nodding politely while life took more than it ever gave back. I told myself not to look at him. Looking would make it harder. Looking would invite questions I didn't want answered. But even without looking, I could feel him beside me. Not in a romantic way, in a heavy way, like standing next to a storm pretending to be calm. There was something restrained there, something locked down too tightly to be comfortable, and that irritated me more than anything. Because control is a luxury too. As the ceremony moved forward, I felt my jaw tighten. I kept smiling because I have always been good at smiling through pain. Smiling is a skill you learn when honesty costs too much. I thought about my mother, about hospital lights and quiet beeping machines, about how fear smells metallic when it settles in your mouth. I thought about the bills stacked like accusations, about nights spent bargaining with the ceiling for miracles that never came. This was supposed to fix that. This was supposed to end something. Instead, standing there, I felt like I was beginning a wound I hadn't agreed to carry. The anger surprised me. I expected numbness. I expected detachment. I didn't expect this heat in my chest, this urge to scream at the absurdity of it all. I wanted to shout that this wasn't love, that this wasn't mine, that I was borrowing a life for a price, but I said nothing. I always say nothing. And then something shifted. I didn't know when it happened. Maybe it was the way his hand tightened just slightly, not for the cameras, not performative, but reflexive. Maybe it was the pause, too long to be scripted, too heavy to be meaningless. My anger sharpened, because hesitation has weight, and weight implies choice. I didn't want him to choose anything. I wanted the script followed to the end so I could leave without looking back. I didn't want cracks in the arrangement. Cracks let feelings in, and feelings complicate exits. I told myself again, this isn't real. But the lie was beginning to sound tired. Inside, something old and wounded stirred. The part of me that had learned not to hope, not to expect kindness without cost. That part didn't trust silence. It didn't trust gentleness. It didn't trust pauses that felt like restraint rather than emptiness. I felt anger at myself for noticing, anger at him for existing too quietly, anger at the universe for daring to blur lines I had drawn in blood. I wanted this over. I wanted my life back, even if it was hard, even if it was cruel. At least it was honest. I didn't know yet that honesty was about to become the most painful thing of all. And I didn't know that the worst part wouldn't be the lie, but the moment it stopped being one. I kept smiling because that was the safest thing to do. A smile doesn't ask questions. A smile doesn't accuse. A smile doesn't break contracts or ruin carefully staged illusions. It floats above the truth and lets everyone pretend they're comfortable. Inside, though, I was burning. Every second stretched longer than it should have, like time itself was resisting the lie we were all participating in. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain, not because I was standing in front of people, but because something inside me was starting to feel seen, and I hated that more than being invisible. I had spent my whole life mastering invisibility. Being unseen is protection. Being unnoticed means you can survive without becoming a target. This, whatever this was, threatened that safety. The words kept coming, flowing over me in soft, ceremonial tones that felt mocking in their calmness. Promises spoken as if they carried weight, as if they weren't hollow sounds arranged for effect. I listened without listening, my mind looping back to the same thought again and again. Get through this. Don't react. Don't feel. Anger works that way. It doesn't explode right away. It simmers, gathering memories, stacking them neatly until the pressure becomes unbearable. I thought about all the times I had stood still while life moved past me. All the times I accepted less because asking for more felt dangerous. All the moments I swallowed my voice because I couldn't afford the consequences of using it. And now here I was, dressed as someone else's dream, surrounded by people who would never know what it costs to stand here without wanting to tear your own skin off. My hand rested in his. I hadn't planned to notice how warm it was. Warmth is intimate. Warmth suggests presence. I wanted detachment, not contact. I tried to pull my fingers back slightly, just enough to remind myself where the line was, but he didn't let go. He didn't tighten either. He just stayed there, steady, like he wasn't performing at all. That made my anger spike, because consistency is dangerous when you're pretending. I wanted him to be distant. I wanted him cold. I wanted him to look at me like a transaction, the way I had prepared myself for. That version of him was easy to manage. This version wasn't. I refused to look at his face. Faces tell stories. Faces betray intentions. And I didn't want to know what story his was trying to tell. The applause came and went like waves crashing against a wall I had built carefully inside myself. I nodded when expected, smiled when required, moved when guided. I felt like a marionette with cut strings, held upright by obligation alone. My anger deepened into something heavier, resentment mixed with fear. Fear of being pulled into a moment I hadn't consented to emotionally. fear of the unknown beneath his restraint. I had agreed to play a role, not to be rewritten. As the ceremony continued, something inside me hardened. A protective wall rose fast and sharp, built from every disappointment I had survived. I told myself that if I stayed guarded enough, nothing could touch me. Not his silence, not his presence, not the strange gravity he seemed to carry without effort. I reminded myself that people like him didn't exist in my world. People like him moved through life with options, with safety nets, with choices. I survived on consequences. That difference mattered. I caught myself wondering why his silence felt so loud, why the space between us felt charged instead of empty. It infuriated me that my body was reacting faster than my logic. Anger flared hotter at that. I didn't trust my instincts anymore. Instincts had led me here, standing in borrowed luxury, pretending my life was something it wasn't. I tightened my jaw and focused on my breathing. In, out. Control was the only thing I could still claim as mine. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the point where this performance would officially end, where the words would be spoken and the role would dissolve, leaving nothing behind but memory and payment. I braced myself, preparing for relief. But instead of relief, I felt tension coil tighter in my chest. The air felt thicker. The room seemed to shrink, closing in around us as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sensed him lean closer, not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for me. My anger surged into sharp alertness. Don't, I thought. I felt it before I heard it. That shift in the air. That subtle tightening of space that happens right before something irreversible occurs. My body reacted first, every muscle going rigid, every instinct screaming danger, because my life has taught me that moments like this never come gently. He leaned in, not dramatically, not urgently, slowly, carefully, as if he understood that whatever he was about to do would fracture something permanently. My anger flared so fast it almost blinded me. How dare he step outside the script? How dare he take something that was supposed to be contained and turn it into something intimate? I wanted to pull away. I wanted to twist my face into something sharp and warning. But my body betrayed me in the smallest, cruelest way. It froze. Years of survival had trained me to stay still when I didn't know what was coming next. Then his breath brushed my ear, and he spoke. Not loudly, not clearly enough for anyone else to hear, just enough for me. The words didn't land gently, they didn't float, they struck, heavy, sudden, violent in their quietness. In that instant, the entire room vanished. All I could hear was blood rushing in my ears. All I could feel was the weight of those words crashing through every wall I had built. My anger exploded outward and inward at the same time, colliding with disbelief so sharp it made me dizzy. That wasn't part of the deal. That wasn't allowed. That wasn't fair. I stared straight ahead, my face locked in place, my smile frozen like a mask glued to skin. Inside, I was screaming, screaming at him, screaming at myself, screaming at the universe for playing this kind of joke on someone who had already paid too much. My thoughts fractured into jagged pieces. What did he mean? Why would he say that? Why now? This was supposed to end here. Clean, controlled, over. But his words didn't feel careless. They felt deliberate, and that terrified me more than anything else. Anger surged through me like fire through dry brush. Anger at the audacity, anger at the timing, anger at the way my heart lurched painfully, traitorously, like it had been waiting for something it had no right to want. I hated myself in that moment, hated the way my chest tightened, hated the way my throat burned, hated that part of me that wanted to turn and demand answers instead of running. I kept my eyes forward because if I looked at him, I knew something would shatter, and I didn't trust myself to survive the sound. Applause erupted around us, loud and celebratory, mocking in its joy. People stood, people clapped, People smiled like they were witnessing something sacred. They had no idea. They didn't know a quiet bomb had just gone off between two people standing inches apart. They didn't know that one sentence had turned a performance into a wound. I walked when I was told to walk. I turned when I was guided to turn. I moved like someone underwater, my body obeying instructions while my mind lagged behind, stuck replaying his words over and over again. Nothing made sense anymore. The anger that had been simmering for hours now roared into something darker: betrayal. Not because he had feelings, not even because he had spoken them, but because he had spoken them when I couldn't respond. He had cornered me in silence. He had taken a moment where I had no escape and filled it with something heavy and personal and irreversible. I hadn't consented to that. I hadn't agreed to carry his truth along with my own burdens. And yet there it was, lodged inside me, impossible to dislodge. Every step felt wrong. Every smile felt grotesque. Every congratulatory glance felt like a lie stacked on top of another lie until I couldn't tell which part of me was real anymore. I could feel him beside me again, steady as before, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just split my carefully controlled world open with a whisper. That calmness infuriated me, because I was unraveling, and he was composed. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to ask how long he had known. I wanted to demand why he thought he had the right to change the rules without asking me. But mostly, I wanted distance. Distance from him. Distance from the words. Distance from the part of me that was starting to crack. I held it together until the moment ended, until the light softened, until the room blurred into noise and movement, until I was no longer required to perform. And when it was finally over, when the cameras stopped flashing and the applause faded, I felt nothing but exhaustion and rage tangled together so tightly I couldn't separate them. I had walked into that day believing I was in control of the damage. I walked out knowing I had been wrong. Because the most dangerous wounds aren't the ones you agree to. They're the ones that arrive quietly and refuse to leave. I left before anyone could stop me. Not dramatically, not with tears spilling down my face like some scene they could gossip about later. I left the way I've always left things that threatened to break me, quietly, with my teeth clenched and my spine straight, carrying the damage inward where no one could see it. The moment the doors closed behind me, the air felt different, thinner, colder, like the world had stopped pretending for my sake. I welcomed that. Pretense exhausts me. I've lived too long inside it. My anger didn't fade. It sharpened. It replayed everything in brutal detail. The whisper, the timing, the restraint in his voice that suggested this wasn't impulse. That suggestion alone made my stomach turn. Because impulse is forgivable, calculation is not. I told myself over and over that I didn't owe him anything. Not understanding, not patience, not grace. I had given exactly what was agreed upon, nothing more. Whatever he was feeling was his problem, not mine. But anger is a liar when it's mixed with fear, because underneath it something else was clawing its way to the surface. Hurt. Not the fragile kind that dissolves into tears, but the solid kind that settles in your chest and changes how you breathe. I hated that most of all. I had spent years making myself hard enough to survive. I had learned to endure disappointment without flinching, to accept loss as routine. I had trained myself not to expect honesty when power was involved. And yet one sentence, one quiet, carefully placed sentence, had cracked that armor like it was made of glass. That terrified me. Days passed, then more days. Time moved, but I felt stuck inside that moment, my mind circling it obsessively like a bruise you keep pressing just to remind yourself it's there. I ignored the calls, the messages, the silence between them. Silence can be loud when you know someone is waiting. I told myself I was doing the right thing. That distance was necessary, that I needed space to sort out what was mine to feel and what had been forced onto me without permission. But at night, when the world quieted and distractions ran out, the anger softened into something heavier. Questions crept in uninvited. How long had he known? Was it real, or just another form of control? Had I been chosen, or replaced? That last thought made my jaw tighten, because replacement is familiar. Replacement is what happens when you're useful, not valued, when your presence is conditional. I refused to let myself become that again. When the truth finally came, it didn't arrive gently. It came stripped of ceremony, raw and awkward and deeply human. No performance, no audience, just honesty, clumsy and imperfect. He told me about the past he never talks about the humiliation he'd buried under success, about how control had become his shield, his language, his way of surviving a world that had taught him vulnerability was weakness. I listened without interrupting, my arms crossed tightly over my chest like I could physically hold myself together. Anger flared again, not because of what he had been through, but because of what he had done with it. Pain doesn't give you the right to trap someone else inside it. I told him that. I told him how reckless it was to say something like that in a moment where I couldn't respond. How unfair it was to place something fragile and heavy in my hands without asking if I was strong enough or willing to carry it. My voice didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble. But inside, I felt like I was holding myself together with sheer will. He listened, really listened, and that somehow made it harder, because accountability is more disarming than excuses. I walked away again after that conversation, not because I didn't believe him, but because belief is dangerous when it comes too soon. I needed proof that didn't come wrapped in words. Weeks passed. Life settled into something quieter. My mother's health improved. The pressure that had driven me into that agreement eased just enough for me to breathe again. Survival stopped screaming for my attention every waking second. And that's when the anger returned full force. Because without desperation clouding my judgment, I could finally see the situation clearly. I could feel how deeply that moment had cut, how much it had shaken me, how close I had come to wanting something I hadn't planned for. Wanting is vulnerability. Vulnerability invites loss. I didn't want to want him. I wanted my anger to be enough to keep me safe. But anger, no matter how justified, can't drown out truth forever. And the truth was this. Something had changed. Something irreversible. Something that would not let me go back to who I was before that whisper. I hated him for that. I hated myself for noticing. And I hated the part of me that knew, with quiet certainty, that whatever came next would hurt, whether I chose him or walked away for good. I tried to rebuild my life the way I always had, methodically, quietly, without leaving room for sentiment. I told myself that structure was safety, that routine could bury the questions if I kept my days full enough. Wake up, work, care, sleep, repeat. But anger doesn't dissolve just because you refuse to look at it. It waits, it sharpens, it reminds you of itself in the smallest, most inconvenient moments, in pauses, in silence, in the way your chest tightens for no obvious reason. I caught myself replaying everything, not because I missed him, but because I was trying to understand the damage. I needed to know exactly where the wound was so I could protect it, reinforce it, seal it shut. I told myself I was angry because he crossed a line, because he didn't ask, because he assumed his feelings deserved space in my life. All of that was true. But beneath that, there was another anger, one I didn't want to admit. Anger at myself for being affected at all, for letting one moment undo years of emotional discipline. I had survived worse than a whisper, so why did this feel heavier? The answer frightened me, because this wasn't about fear of being hurt. It was about fear of being seen, seen without the armor, seen without the struggle, seen as something other than a survivor. That kind of exposure feels like standing naked in front of the world, with no guarantee of mercy. I kept my distance deliberately. I didn't allow myself to wonder how he was coping. I didn't ask what consequences followed his choice. I told myself it didn't matter. His life had safety built into it. Mine never had. But then, the truth reached me anyway, slipping through the cracks I hadn't sealed. He had walked away from something massive, something that defined him in his world. He had chosen loss publicly, decisively, without knowing if it would change anything for me. That unsettled me, because sacrifice without leverage is rare and dangerous and real. My anger shifted shape. It didn't disappear, it transformed. It became heavier, quieter, laced with something that felt uncomfortably like grief. Grief for the version of myself who had believed love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Grief for the certainty I had relied on to keep my life predictable. Predictability is a form of control. I had clung to it like oxygen. I realized then that part of my anger wasn't about what he had done. It was about what he had undone. He had disrupted the narrative I used to survive. The one where I was alone, but safe. Independent, but guarded. He had shown me something else was possible. And I resented him for it. Because possibility demands choice. And choice demands courage. I thought about all the times I had chosen safety over honesty. All the relationships I had kept shallow on purpose. All the doors I had closed before anyone could knock too loudly. I told myself I was strong for that. But strength can become a cage if you never unlock it. I fought the urge to reach out, not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. I was afraid that if I spoke to him again, my anger would dissolve into something harder to control. Hope. Hope is dangerous when you've lived long enough without it. I didn't want to rebuild my life around another person's choices. I didn't want my future to hinge on someone else's willingness to stay. And yet, the thought of never confronting what had happened felt like another form of surrender. One night, sitting alone with nothing but my thoughts and the low hum of the city outside my window, I finally admitted something I had been avoiding. I wasn't angry because he had loved me. I was angry because he had loved me without asking if I knew how to be loved back. That realization hurt more than anything else. Because it meant the work ahead wasn't about him proving himself. It was about me deciding whether I was willing to risk losing the version of myself that had survived everything so far. Survival had been my identity for so long that I didn't know who I was without it, and that terrified me more than walking away ever could. I understood then that whatever choice I made next would cost me something. Anger, safety, control, or him. There was no version of this where I walked away untouched. And for the first time in my life, I realized that avoiding pain wasn't the same as choosing peace. Sometimes it was just another way of staying alone. I didn't go back because I missed him. I didn't go back because I was lonely. I went back because I was tired of running from questions that followed me everywhere I went. Anger can fuel distance for only so long. Eventually, it exhausts itself, leaving you face to face with whatever truth you were trying not to see. Mine waited patiently, unflinching, refusing to soften just because I was afraid. I told myself that if I didn't confront this now, it would follow me into every future I tried to build. That whisper would become a shadow, showing up in quiet moments, reminding me of the life I never allowed myself to consider. I hated that he had that power. I hated that I had given it to him without realizing. When I saw him again, there was no grand setup, no spectacle, no audience to hide behind, just space. Honest, uncomfortable space that forced me to stand in my own skin without distraction. He looked different, not smaller, not broken, just stripped down, like someone who had already accepted loss and was prepared to carry it without complaint. That unsettled me more than desperation ever could. I didn't soften my voice. I didn't ease my posture. I didn't offer forgiveness or comfort. I spoke with the sharpness of someone who had learned that clarity is a form of protection. I told him exactly what that moment had done to me, how it had made me feel trapped, how it had awakened fears I had buried carefully, how it had threatened the fragile sense of control I had fought my entire life to maintain. I didn't dress it up. I didn't spare his feelings. Pain, when handled gently, has a way of returning. He listened without interrupting, without defending himself, without trying to reframe what I felt. That alone disarmed something in me, because I was used to people explaining me away. I told him I didn't need grand gestures. I didn't need promises spoken too early. I didn't need a future mapped out in words that might collapse under pressure. What I needed was agency. I needed to know that I could walk away without punishment, that staying would be a choice, not an obligation. That love, if it existed at all, wouldn't demand silence from me. He didn't argue. He told me he didn't expect forgiveness, that he had spoken because he was afraid of losing something he hadn't meant to find, that he had misjudged the cost of timing and paid for it willingly. I watched his face as he spoke, not searching for romance, not searching for reassurance, but searching for truth. The raw, unpolished kind that doesn't perform well but lasts longer. Something inside me loosened. Not trust, not love, permission. Permission to consider something without betraying myself. I realized then that my anger had protected me, but it had also isolated me. It had kept me alive, but it had also kept me alone. And while solitude had once been necessary, it no longer felt like strength. It felt like fear wearing armor. I told him I wasn't ready to promise anything, that I didn't know what this could become, that I needed space to move at my own pace, without expectation or pressure. And for the first time, I meant it when I said that if he couldn't accept that, I would leave. He didn't ask me to stay. That mattered, because choice only exists when walking away is allowed. I didn't feel relief in that moment. I felt something heavier, something quieter, responsibility. Responsibility for my own heart. Responsibility for not using anger as a shield when what I really needed was honesty. I understood then that loving someone didn't mean abandoning myself. It meant standing still long enough to be seen without disappearing. And that terrified me. But terror, I was learning, wasn't always a warning. Sometimes it was an invitation. I didn't walk into the ending the way stories usually pretend people do. Lighter, certain, healed. I walked into it carrying everything I hadn't resolved, everything I was still angry about, everything that scared me enough to make my hands ache. Healing didn't arrive like a revelation. It arrived like a decision I had to keep making, even when it felt easier not to. What surprised me most was how quiet everything became once I stopped fighting myself. No dramatic rush of emotion, no sudden certainty, just space. Space to breathe without bracing for impact. We didn't recreate anything that had already happened. That mattered to me. I refused repetition. I refused symbolism that felt like pressure. I refused anything that looked like closure if it demanded forgetting. What came next was smaller, slower, real. I stayed because I wanted to, not because I was convinced. I stayed because walking away no longer felt like protection. It felt like avoidance. And I had done enough avoiding for one lifetime. I didn't stop being angry overnight. Anger doesn't disappear just because you choose connection. It lingers, reshapes itself, reminds you where your boundaries are. I let it stay. I stopped treating it like an enemy. Anger had saved me. Now it could step back. I learned that love doesn't erase the parts of you that survived hardship. It doesn't demand you soften where the world once sharpened you. Real love makes room for those edges instead of sanding them down. I didn't become someone new. I became someone more honest. I spoke when things felt wrong. I withdrew when I needed space. I stopped apologizing for needing time. I stopped confusing silence with strength. And he didn't flinch. That was the difference. No whispering in corners, no declarations in moments where escape wasn't possible. No pressure disguised as devotion, just presence. I realized then that what hurt most about that first moment wasn't the feeling itself. It was the loss of control, the sense that my choice had been taken from me, even briefly. And choice, I understood now, was the one thing I could never give up again. So I claimed it. Every day. I chose when to lean in. I chose when to step back. I chose when to trust. I chose when to hold my ground. And slowly, without fanfare, something settled inside me. Not certainty, not perfection, peace. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't prove itself, the kind that coexists with scars instead of pretending they're gone. I no longer needed to tell myself this was real. I no longer needed reassurance whispered at critical moments. Reality revealed itself in consistency, in respect, in the absence of fear. I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I stopped rehearsing exits. I stayed. Not because love conquered everything, but because it didn't try to. And in that stillness, in that earned quiet, I finally understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. Survival taught me how to endure. Anger taught me how to protect myself. But choice taught me how to live.